Hello. On behalf of all of us at Academia SG, welcome to our pre-GE 2025 webinar with Professor Kevin Tan. If you're joining us this evening, you must know that general elections must be held in Singapore this year and that the election boundaries were recently set. This means that in the context of GE 2025, this webinar is, well, purely academic. It has no bearing on what happens in the coming months at all. Nevertheless, we feel that we should ride on the current interest in this topic to explore some of the deeper legal and constitutional dimensions of how electoral democracy is practiced in Singapore. Because there will, we assume, be many more elections to come. So reviewing the rules of the game for future polls, asking if these are fair or foul, isn't a purely abstract intellectual exercise for us as citizens in the long term. To help us do that, we're extremely grateful to have with us Professor Kevin Tan, author of numerous scholarly books and articles about Singapore's constitution and political system. He teaches at NUS, at NTU, and we are delighted today to be his students for this evening.
Thank you very much, Cherian, for the very warm welcome once again to Academia SG. Actually, truth be told, when I proposed giving this talk to Cherian, I had absolutely no idea when the Electoral Boundaries Delineation Committee was going to come out with their report. And I am kind of chuffed to learn that after it came up, there's so much interest in the subject, and actually has been the subject of quite a few excellent commentaries that are out there already, both from a sort of a very mathematical point of view, looking at how the numbers work or don't actually work, and then also looking at it from sort of the social political point of view as well. I will reference some of that towards the end of my talk, but for now, what I propose to do in this talk is to go back to basic principles, right? As a constitutional lawyer, I am very, very concerned about the nature of elections. I mean, we often talk about, democracy being, or rather elections being the sine qua non of democracy. But that's not enough, right? You obviously need to ensure that the process in which your elections are held are also free and fair. And so we can talk about free elections, we can talk about fair elections, but beyond that, what rules might we want to ensure that this actually manifests itself in a real democracy? I mean, one can say we can have fair and free elections, but those elections shall only involve persons, say, above the age of 35 or above the age of 40, right? At the same time, we could also say, well, yes, it involves everybody from the age of 18 onwards, but we'll have one election every 30 years. I mean, that again kind of defeats the entire purpose. So today we're going to look at a rather small corner, but a very, very important one in relation to how we actually exercise our vote and how boundaries, constituencies are drawn. I like to tell people that previously I used to live in a place. I lived in a home in Bedok, and we lived there for 18 years. I never moved house, and when I moved there, it was Bedok SMC, and then a few years later we became Eunos GRC, and then Eunos GRC disappeared and we became Aljunied GRC, right? And we never moved, right? In my current place, I've been here about 16, 17 years, and we've been Tampines all along, but suddenly I realized we've been sort of sliced off with a little sliver, and now we are called Tampines Changkat SMC. So, within a span of 30 years, you find that you can actually traverse something like, 5 different electoral boundaries, different locations, without moving very far. Well, with that, let me share my slides. I'll take you through a thing with the assistance of some of the graphics that I've prepared. Okay. Okay. Now, let us begin with the legalities involved in drawing up of electoral boundaries. There is very, very little by way of law insofar as how do we construct our electoral boundaries, who gets to call the shots, how do you draw these boundaries, and so on. Now, when Singapore became independent for the first time in 1963, we had in the state constitution provision Article 23(1), where it states that the Legislative Assembly shall consist of such number of elected members as the legislature may by law provide, and until other provision is so made, the number of members shall be 51. So you will see that in the early part of our history, in the Constitution, the number of constituencies is actually embedded in the Constitution itself. Now, this remained the case for about 20 years and was changed only in 1984. So in 1984, of course, there was a renumbering all the different provisions because there was a reprint of the Constitution that was published in 1980. All right. So what was Article 23 became effectively Article 39. The words are fairly similar. But you will notice the words in red, right? Parliament shall consist of such number of elected members as is equal to the number of constituencies prescribed by or under any law made by the legislature. So here they don't tell you how many how many constituencies you should have. It used to be 51. And in 1984, at the time when this amendment was made, there were 75 seats in Parliament. Now, one of the reasons that were given for not putting the number of the constituencies in the Constitution is that every time you made some amendment, you would end up having to make a constitutional amendment, which is absolutely true. They actually had to, every time they changed the number. In 1968, they moved it from 51 to 58, and then to 65 in 72, 69 in 76, and finally 75 in 1980. Yeah, every time they did this, they actually had to amend the Constitution. So it was a little bit of a hassle. I mean, not so difficult given the political realities and the dominance of the PAP in Parliament. But nonetheless, it is nevertheless a constitutional amendment. So it was thought, well, let's not put it in the Constitution itself. Let's leave it to ordinary legislation like the Parliamentary Elections Act, right? The other reason for the change was, of course, in 1984, they introduced non-constituency members of parliament, and then later on in 1988, the GRC system, right? So if you look at the Constitution as it stands today, Article 39, there is also provision for a group constituency. At that time, sorry, it was 6 in number. Now we have 12 NCMPs, right? This is the 1984 amendment. So insofar as the law is concerned, the Constitution doesn't have very much to say about it. What about other law, right? You've got the Parliamentary Elections Act. Now, the Parliamentary Elections Act, Section 8, is the relevant provision. And it simply reads, the minister may, by notification in the Gazette, specify the names and boundaries of the electoral divisions of Singapore for the purposes of elections under this act. As you can see, it's very, very broadly drafted. It seems to give the minister an almost limitless discretion in how to name the boundaries, how to specify the boundaries, and all the minister needs to do. It doesn't have to go back to Parliament. Minister simply announces this, publishes this in the Gazette, and that would be the law. All right. Now, of course, that begs the question, should it be so simple? This is a very important exercise in drawing boundaries. Should we just leave it entirely to the minister to do it in this fashion? Now, if you look at the Parliamentary Elections Act, there are a few other, and this is ordinary law, not the Constitution, there are a few other requirements in the delineation. So it is not entirely a carte blanche, right? So what do you have? There is a provision that says the president must declare any electoral division to be a GRC, group representation constituency, group size between 3 and 6. This is nothing more than to back up what's already in the Constitution. Every GRC must be designated as requiring at least one candidate in each group as belonging to the Malay or Indian or other minority community, right? So this is again nothing, nothing special. Now, here is where some hard requirements come in, right? The number of GRCs with Malay candidates must be 3/5 of the total number of GRCs. So in other words, no matter how you cut up the pie, right, you must ensure that of the total number of GRCs, 60%, right, 3/5 of them must contain Malay candidates. Of course, that's the de minimis position. That's the minimum position. You can have more. You can have more than 3/5, right? Then there is something that was put in a bit later. This came in the 1990s, and I'll show you the timeline, how these occurred, that there should now be at least 8 electoral divisions that shall be single-member constituencies, right? So this can be changed easily. It could be 4 tomorrow, it could be none, but at present it says 8 electoral divisions that shall be SMCs. And finally, the number of members returned in the GRCs must not be less than 1/4 of the total number of members returned in the election. So in other words, you have to have a substantial number of GRCs, right? So these are in a way sort of your fairly, sort of hard requirements, right? But other than that, right, if you look at the words in Section 8 of the Parliamentary Elections Act, there appears to be no other hard requirements, right? There's no guideline. There are no rules as to how many members there should be, right? What is the ratio or idealized ratio between an MP and the number of constituencies he or she can realistically serve? I mean, it would be quite difficult to say, well, 1 MP to 100,000. I think, your MPS would be a nightmare. It wouldn't be possible, right? So there must be some way of fixing a point. You can't have so many moving points. You either decide that there shall be, only a maximum of 100 members in parliament, in which case you take the total voting population divided by 100, and you know exactly what the median figure ought to be, right? The ratio ought to be. Or you can say, let's fix a ratio. We think that only realistically, 1 MP can serve maximum 20,000 or 25,000, right? And then you say, okay, if that's 25,000, then we work backwards. You divide the total number of voters by 25, and then you figure out roughly how many MPs you should be having. But there's none of that. There's nothing actually in the Parliamentary Elections Act, and certainly not in the Constitution, that tells you what's the method of determining, the boundaries, the size of the boundaries, and so on. Now, there's the other problem, of course, is nothing there quite says that you have to make sure that your size of your constituencies are about the same. There's nothing that says that, right? So it kind of begs the question, right? In all these matters, does the minister have an unfettered discretion to draw up these electoral boundaries? And now here, I, of course, have to put in this little quote. It's a very well-known quote for those people who are familiar with judicial review of administrative action. Well-known case of Cheng Zuanzi against the Minister of Home Affairs, where the Court of Appeal of Singapore, our highest court, made a very important point relating to unfettered discretion. It says, in our view, the notion of a subjective or unfettered discretion is contrary to the rule of law. All power has legal limits, and the rule of law demands that the courts should be able to examine the exercise of discretionary power. If, therefore, the executive, in exercising its discretion under an act of parliament, has exceeded the 4 corners within which parliament has decided it can exercise its discretion, such an exercise of discretion will be ultra vires the act, and a court of law must be able to hold it to be so, right? So this is establishing the point that, look, when we talk about state powers, government powers, they all must flow from some law. And the body that keeps people in check, the executive in check, is the courts, right? So anyway, just keep that at the back of your mind, because I'm quite sure you'll be wondering, at some point, will somebody be able to take action or sue the prime minister, right, who is the minister in charge, for infraction of some of these rules? Okay, now let's take a look at practice. Here, I want to go back a bit into history, because if you look at the recent developments, it's a mess. It doesn't tell you anything. You don't know why people are doing, A or B or whatever. And so it's useful to kind of look at the first time that the elections were contemplated on a wide scale for Singapore. And this would be in 1954. The Randall Commission report made some recommendations on a method of delineation, but it was not terribly helpful, right? That was in 1954. But in preparations for the 1959 general election, there was an all-party delimitation committee that was established. Here are some of the members of that committee. G.G. Thompson, you will see on the top left picture, he was the chair. He was the director of public relations, and he was the chair of this particular committee. M. Punadure, who was the director, was in charge of the elections department, was the secretary. And you had a number of politicians from different political parties. Darussaleh, you have Teo Chan Bee, you've got Toh Chin Chai, and I think there was one other person, right? In any case, this committee was made up of members from all the political parties that had a stake in the electoral process. And they made a couple of recommendations, right? They said, we are working on a blank slate, right? We are very patently aware that there are no rules that govern the way in which we go about delineating electoral boundaries, but we would like ourselves to be governed by some key principles, right? So this is really good governance from within, right? It was, rather than say, all right, let's do whatever we like, they say, no, we ought to establish. We are the first ones, all right? We're coming into it, general elections, all right? A fully elected government for the first time. 55 was kind of limited because the governor still had certain powers to nominate members into the Legislative Assembly. But by 59, no more governor, right? And there were no more nominated seats. They were all elected seats. So they decided, okay, we're going to have 4 sort of major operating principles. The most important of all, it said, was the democratic principle that wherever a voter votes, one elector's weight should carry equal weight with others. There should therefore be the nearest approximation to equality in the number of electors registered in each division, right? Bear in mind, this is a very important point about equality. Secondly, as voters are bound by common interests of the community and their neighbors, consideration should be given to identify interests or in the occupation of each division. And they gave the example, if there are villages, don't go dissecting these villages and so on. I mean, this is common sense, but they felt that this is something important. In other words, you've got to be human about it. You don't just sit around, right? Like the European powers did in Berlin and started dividing up Africa. You don't do it on a piece of paper. You go down the ground, kind of understand what's going on, then you make these divisions. Third, boundaries should not only be clear on the map, but it should be clear on the ground to the electors. Now, this must make some sense, right? It doesn't make sense if I have a big river running next to me. Well, we don't have big rivers in Singapore. Kallang, maybe Serangoon, but they're all canals now. But there's a huge highway right next to me, right? And obviously, in my mind, people who live on the other side of the highway shouldn't be in the same constitution as I am, unless it's a mega constitution, right? Constituency. So, these geographies do matter. Clearly define natural features such as rivers or ridges or hills, or vacant areas like swamplands. Artificial features such as roads have therefore been used as boundaries wherever possible. Okay. Finally, it says consideration should be given to the problems of the candidate in canvassing. As such, constituencies should be compact in shape and should reduce as far as possible distances that need to be covered. Right, this is a very, very practical consideration. and also has sort of theoretical considerations that the more compact you are, the better coordinated your constituents can be, and more cohesive, right? So these were four operating principles which they decided to abide by. They also said finally that they were aware we are an ad hoc body to carry out an essential part of preparation, but it is our view that in the light of growing responsibilities of a fully elected assembly and with the steady change in distribution of population within the island, the machinery for the delimitation of boundaries should be formalized and given to the authority and direction of the assembly. In other words, Parliament should control this, right? Shouldn't just give it to one body. Now, they then made a couple of proposals. They suggested that maybe there should be a special delimitation committee. They, of course, looked to Britain, no surprise at that time. And there was a commission for redistribution of seats in the UK. Their view was the person who chairs this committee should be the Speaker of Parliament, but the Speaker should be only a nominal chair. In other words, not running the show, but just as head, because elections has to do with Parliament. The deputy chair is the important one. And there they said you should have a high court judge, right? The idea of having a high court judge is that the judge knows the law. He's unlikely to countenance any kind of, playing fast and hard with the rules, right? So he would be there to preside over all the meetings and deliberations. Now, other members that might be appointed, and of course, these titles were from that period, right? Home Secretary, which will probably be the Minister for Home Affairs, right? Minister for Housing and Local Development, Local Government, which would be Minister of National Development, right? But only after consultation with the opposition, right? Then there would be two assessors, the Registrar General and the Director of the Ordnance Survey, or what you call Surveyor General. And they had this idea that if the parties are unhappy, and I'm here talking about political parties, are in some way unhappy with the way in which the commission drew up the boundaries, they can make representations to appeal, right? So this was what they thought it should look like. Well, of course, it didn't materialize in this way because, shortly after that, within 4 years, Singapore was independent from Great Britain and now a part of the Federation of Malaysia. So again, we were no longer running ourselves as a self-standing colony. We are now a state within the Federation. And so within that state federal context, there would be two sets of elections. There would be the state elections, that means for the Legislative Assembly of Singapore. And then, of course, there would be elections in the Federation, right, for the federal seats. So in any case, again, they tried to look at what to do. So they appointed another electoral boundaries delimitation committee, this time under Stanley Stewart, who was the permanent secretary in the Prime Minister's office. By the way, the elections department has always been in the Prime Minister's office. It used to be elections used to be under the watch of the colonial secretary, and the colonial secretary is sort of the colonial equivalent of a chief minister. All right, so it has always been sort of under the PMO. Now, he was charged with reviewing electoral boundaries with a view to adjusting them for a more equal representation throughout all 51 constituencies. Now, one of the things that you might want to note is that in those days, there was a problem, right? Because Singapore's large chunk of its population was actually concentrated in the southern part of Singapore, and a lot of parts of Singapore, especially in the north, were rural areas. And with rural areas, the population density is much smaller, much lower than that in the cities, right, in the urban areas. So there was always this constant worry about how to balance it out. Of course, today we don't have this problem, right, with the rural and urban areas. Every area looks more or less like the same, but not then. Now, In 1967, now, by the way, there was a report in 1963, but that was never published, and I've not been able to get my hands on it, so I have no idea exactly what were the detailed recommendations of the Stewart Committee, right? But we do know one of these recommendations, which was put into effect in 1967. Again, this committee was constituted to prepare for the 1968 general election, and one of the terms of reference was that it should eliminate any it should continue to keep all the constituencies, right? Not eliminate any of them, and also to recommend any changes or adjustments that are necessary to ensure more equal representation throughout the constituencies. Now, again, this concept of equality, which we take for granted, right? Obviously, your vote is the same as my vote. The value of it should be the same, you know, was something that played very much in the minds of these early committees. And one of the ways they decided they would deal with this, right, to make it not too difficult on themselves, right, is to adopt a standard deviation allowable, right? As I told you, there were rural areas and there are urban areas. In urban areas, it's much easier to delineate because, the population is very, very compact. It's not so compact in the rural areas. You have pockets, you have villages here, you've got, very sparse populations, most of it. So this 20%, which is quite high actually, was regarded as necessary in this kind of environment to try and balance the value of the votes. In other words, we'll give ourselves an allowance, right? Need not all be so close to the median line. You can have 20% above, 27% below, right? Now, this was the policy that was adopted by the electoral boundaries delineation committees from 1967 all the way till 1980. Now, 1980, for no apparent reason, the committee decided that they would now increase the allowable deviation from 20% to 30%. Now, this strikes me as very odd, given that you needed this 20% to play around with in a rural urban setting. But by 1980 anyway, most of the locations of our satellite towns were already there. Much of the population that used to be concentrated in the city center had already been moved out towards these other areas. Toa Payoh was ready. Queenstown had been around for a very long time. Woodlands was already being developed very rapidly in the 1980s, right? So, and Bedok was already there. Tampines Newtown maybe a little bit later, but already planned, right? So this is where it's odd. I cannot understand why they increase the allowable deviation from 20% to 30% because it's very, very high. Now, the only clue to that can be found in the 1984 committee report, and it said something like this: it's not practical nor desirable to limit the size of every electoral division to 21,000. That was their median number, okay, as that would entail massive redrawing of the boundaries. Well, hey, isn't that your job? I mean, I know you want to make it not so difficult, but surely, what about this principle of equality, right? Anyway, by 1988, this committee was charged with creating the next maximum number of GRCs because that was the year it was introduced. Okay. Now, I'm going to go through this quite quickly, right? Just to tell you that by 1991, this talk of equality, trying to equalize, was totally abandoned. If you read the terms of reference, and these are just basically copied from the terms of reference of the, of course, I've summarized it, otherwise, it wouldn't fill the slides. But if you look at them, they don't tell you what is the basis. It simply says, recommend required number of GRCs as SMCs based on number of electors. The formula is more or less the same. Ensure minimum of 8 SMCs. Well, yes, that's what the Elections Act says, right? What else? It doesn't really say very much. But you begin to see tinkering around with sizes of SMCs and GRCs. If you look at the 2011 term of reference, it says, please create smaller GRCs, less 6-member ones, average size doesn't exceed 5. Okay. And so now they keep telling you, okay, what do you need to do? Please have at least 12 SMCs, have 13 SMCs or whatever. So down the line, you see the terms of reference being rather different. No longer was there any concern about parity of voting or equalizing voter value. It was all about how many GRCs, how many SMCs. Okay. And the latest one, one other thing you should maybe take note of, 1996. I will talk about 1996 in a moment, but you will see they say minimum of 8 SMCs, with one of them consisting principally the boundary of the former Macpherson. This is bizarre, and I'll tell you why in a moment, all right? This is the latest one, right? Again, review boundaries, recommend numbers of GRCs, SMCs based on number of electors. They say, well, you should take into consideration significant changes in the number of electors in the current electoral division as a result of population shifts and housing developments. Well, of course. I mean, isn't that what they are supposed to do anyway? Anyway, and the last thing, again, on the average sizes of GRCs, proportion of MPs elected from SMCs should be about the same as in the last election. Why? Why should it be like the same as in the last election? Did you think that this number that they had in the last election, 28,000 whatever to one MP, 28,520 to one MP, is that some magic figure? Have they arrived at that is optimum? I don't know. They don't tell us. Okay. Now I want to talk about Macpherson, 1996, right? This is the poor bouncing ball of politics in Singapore. 1968, Macpherson is created for the first time for the 1968 general election. When they created GRCs in 1988, it was left alone. The following election, 1991, they brought Macpherson into Marine Parade GRC. In 1997, right, or rather 96 was the report, 97 was the election, PM instructed the EBRC to carve out Macpherson constituency, and the reason was so that there could be a one-to-one fight between Matthias Yao from the PAP and Chee Soon Juan, right? Basically what had happened was that Chee Soon Juan had criticized PAP for, the cost of HDB flats, and he basically said, look, if I had the power, I could, build them more efficiently and so on. And then there was this challenge, and one of the things I think Chi said was he told Matthias, stop hiding behind your GRC. You come out and you take me on one-on-one. And for that, they carved out Macpherson, right? So this is kind of makes nonsense of this delineation, right? Anyway, Matthias Yao kept his seat. 2011, they brought it back into Marine Parade GRC. And then in 2015, they carved it out as an SMC again, right? What was the reason? Well, it's not on official record, but I remember talking to Tan Chuan Jin at one point after this 2011 election, and he kind of let on that, oh, well, they thought Tin Pei Ling didn't do very well, and maybe they should just carve out Macpherson as her own SMC. And lo and behold, they did it exactly as that. Anyway, 10 years later now, they're going to take Macpherson back into Marine Parade, Braddell Heights. New constituency, newer GRC. Okay. What are the problems? Number one is disappearing constituencies, right? And this is something everyone kind of talks about. And I wanted to see how real the patterns are, right? Now, mind you, if you followed me with all the different terms of reference for the Electoral Boundaries Commission, you will find that none of them said get rid of all the SMCs that the PAP did badly in, or all the GRCs that we didn't do well in. Never said anything like that. But the pattern seems to be that that seems to be a consideration, maybe an invisible consideration. It may be something that they subconsciously or reflectively do, right? So 1991, PAP lost 4 SMCs, Bukit Gombak, Hougang, Nee-Soon, Potong Pasir. They didn't do well in Eunos GRC, Braddell Heights, Bukit Batok, Changi, Nee-Soon South. The next in time for the next election, what did they do? They recommended reducing number of SMCs, originally 21 down to 9, turn everybody else into a GRC. Eunos GRC, which is already a GRC, mind you, they split it up, right? And they had it absorbed by other constituencies. Braddell Heights, which they did badly in, got absorbed in Marine Parade. Bukit Batok, which they didn't do very well in, got absorbed in Bukit Timah GRC. Nee-Soon South became absorbed in Ang Mo Kio GRC. Okay. If it's one-off, okay, maybe coincidence. Next round, decentralized voting was introduced. I'll say a little bit about decentralized voting. This is an important point which I think people have forgotten actually, right? The political parties taking part in the elections, and I'm very specific about political parties, not just the government, by the way, right? Every political party that takes part in elections will know at the end of the election how each precinct votes for or against you. This was because in 1992, Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong said, we are going to link voting with upgrading. So if you vote for us, we will upgrade your HDB flats. And of course, everyone said, well, look here, how do you know whether I vote for you? My vote's supposed to be secret. I said, no, we don't check on the votes. We don't read your votes. Of course we don't, right? But we know that if we split up the counting centers, instead of having all these boxes brought, they used to bring them all in buses to centralized counting centers. Now, no more, right? From 1997 onwards, they were all decentralized. In 1997, there were 46 counting centers, and each one of them were counting according to the precinct. So you know pretty much to the block how well you did, right? What's the percentage and so on. Now, what is the significance of this? Well, it is significant because anyone who has a total command of this information can then say, all right, let's try and, fix those constituencies that are not so good for us, right? Maybe move them out and so on, right? So this is a very, very important point. The one person who has, or the one party that has got all the information is the party that contested every single seat, which is, of course, the PAP. So anyway, 1997 election, the lowest performing GRC was Cheng San. Cheng San got split up, then got absorbed by Ang Mo Kio GRC, Aljunied GRC. In 2011, the PAP lost the Aljunied GRC and Hougang SMC. They didn't touch those, right? Continue to leave them alone. Its worst performing but winning constituencies were Joo Chiat SMC. And then 2 years later, there was a by-election because of the resignation of Michael Palmer, the speaker. And so the Workers' Party won Punggol East SMC. But by 2015 election, Joo Chiat SMC was already absorbed into Marine Parade. All right. 2015, PAP loses Aljunied, Hougang. The worst performing ones for the PAP were Fengshan, Punggol East, East Coast GRC. Well, what was the recommendation? Punggol East SMC would combine with Sengkang West SMC, and Sengkang Central form a new GRC called Sengkang GRC. Fengshan, which they didn't do very well in, got absorbed into Marine Parade. So you can see how some of those have disappeared, right? East Coast was kind of left alone. 2020 election, they lost 10 seats with Aljunied GRC, Sengkang GRC, Hougang SMC, right? The worst performing ones were Bukit Batok, Bukit Panjang, Marymount, Marine Parade, West Coast. And this is a mess. This is the latest one, is massive changes all over the place. But you can see that the worst performing constituencies have either been absorbed somehow into a bigger GRC, right? Or totally just sort of split up, right? And then the creation. out of nowhere of a number of new SMCs. So this is the one that I wanted to tell you about. This is where vote will decide your upgrading policy. In fact, this was announced in 1992, but came into effect with the 1997 election, right? Where for the first time, we were all rather stunned to find out that the state will know how we voted by precinct. And of course, once you know how well a precinct does, you can, if you choose to, gerrymander such that it can benefit you, right? But with these kinds of benefit, it always can cut both ways. I think the important point that we should never forget is that when we try and design an institution, it's got to work for everyone. I mean, yes, you can go around playing hard and fast and loose with rules because you happen to be in charge. But one day you may no longer be in charge. Then you wish the rules were a bit different, right? Okay, well, the other problem that I've been harking on from the beginning actually is this problem of malapportionment. This has been talked about by a number of people, but I just wanted to show you some figures, right? Now, I am very bad in mathematics, but I just sort of take 100 as your baseline figure. And I worked out such that if you allow 30% deviation, which is the current norm from 1980 onwards, and still is the norm today, no revision whatsoever, it's very close to doubling in other words, the difference between the lowest and the highest. The highest is almost double of the lowest. In fact, when you hit about 133, it will be almost double already, right? 33%. If you add 33% to 100 is 133. You reduce 33% is 67. That differential is almost double, right? And if you look at how the Electoral Boundaries Commission divided up the various constituencies, you will find that they actually did not abide by their own guidelines. Right? I mean, from 2001 to 2015, Potong Pasir was below the smallest allowable number of electors, right? They didn't exceed the highest figures. But if you look at the figure in 2015, because Potong Pasir was allowed to go below 19,355, which was the 30% benchmark, excuse me, the voter in Potong Pasir is effectively twice as powerful as the voter in Bukit Panjang, right? Because Bukit Panjang got 34,000. The number of voters in Potong Pasir is 17,407. So if you talk about malapportionment, this is what it's about, right? Surely the value of your vote and my vote must be the same. Cannot be that your vote is double the value of mine. Put it in another way. For in the same election, if you double the number of voters in Potong Pasir, they can send 2 MPs into parliament, whereas the poor guys in Bukit Panjang could send only 1 at the same time, right? Well, is this fair? Foul? All right. Enough criticism about the system. Let's be constructive. What can we do? What reforms would be required? I would say, number one, we have to create a constitutionally safeguarded independent elections commission with a mandate over the drawing of electoral boundaries. Secondly, the Independent Boundaries Delineation Committee must be guided by clear criteria of delineation based on equality of vote and the geographical identity. In other words, we go back to what they said back in 1963. It must make sense as much as it is on paper as it is on land, right? You don't live in one area, right? You don't live in Bukit Timah and be told that you live in Tanjong Pagar. Right? I think people would say, anyone who knows Singapore would say, come on, that's far away, right? Electoral delineation exercise should commence 2 years into each parliament's term. And some people say, well, that's too early. What if there are shifts? This is Singapore, okay? You don't get mass migration out of nowhere. You don't build flats there. You don't have housing there. People don't move. It's as simple as that. So I don't think we are going to be taken by any serious surprises if we begin the delineation process a little earlier. Don't wait until it's just before the election, because it's patently unfair, except to the people who drew the lines, right? People who claim to have worked the ground, or I'm sure they worked the ground, suddenly they get the carpet pulled out from under their feet. They don't have the ground anymore. In any case, any change to electoral boundaries must stand for at least 12 months. This is my proposal. Do not effect it until at least 12 months has passed. Fourth, I propose that there should be some form of appeal over illogical, impractical drawing of boundaries, right? Especially given that now many of the MPs are also town councillors and have to run town councils. There is an added layer of responsibility there. And a very important point, Delineation Committee must not be allowed to look at the previous elections' precinct-based results, because that would prejudice anyone, right, who has a mind to favor any political party, and this would not be accepted. So thank you very much. I think that just a reference to a couple of things that I saw recently while preparing for this talk. Cape has a very nice explainer which is available on this site, and Jolene Teo, I've never met her before, but she did a couple of very good TikTok videos questioning the mathematics behind and explaining, the figures. I couldn't do any better, but so here are the references, and here's the map that we've been talking about. So come what may, come the elections, vote carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Do you want to unshare that map? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. It's extremely informative, including telling us about that committee set up after the Rendell Constitution, which proposed what seems like very, very sensible principles that might, I guess, be worth resuscitating if we try to imagine what the principles would be for a new institution that looks at these things, right?
Yes.
I just want to maybe help clarify one point that you raised. You made you talked a lot about equality, and it seems counterintuitive, right? Why would these very troublesome Potong Pasir voters who keep voting in Cham Si Tong back at the day, right, be made twice as powerful as other voters? And if you look at it that way, then it seems to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. But of course, if you flip it, the rationale becomes obvious, right? If there is very popular and basically immovable opposition incumbent, you want to confine them.
That's right.
You want
Yes.
to quarantine them, right?
Yes.
So you don't, even as other constituencies grow larger, 20,000, 25,000 voters and so on,
Yes.
you don't want to do that in Potong Pasir by Potong Pasir absorbing, precincts and neighborhoods from neighboring constituencies, because that just means that
Oh,
opposition
you get
grows,
infected.
right?
Yes.
So I think one very interesting feature, one interesting trend. I mean, you've pointed out the trend of what happens to PAP seats that almost lose. Yeah, and they're the ones that are most vulnerable. But interestingly, once the opposition wins a seat, fortunately, the PAP hasn't had the practice of wiping them away. So,
Yes.
so the opposition seats actually become, untouchable in a way that again sort of belies the principle that no, this is all about the rational apportionment due to population changes and so on. But clearly, there's this political factor as well, right? I think the PAP correctly recognizes that it would be far too outrageous for boundary redrawing to say remove Aljunied GRC or to break it up after it's been won by the population. So you
Right.
can break it up if the PAP just wins by whisker, but you're not going to break it up once the opposition takes over.
Well,
Or
that's kind of a
it can do it, but it
yes,
hasn't.
yeah.
Right? It has left incumbent opposition MPs alone. But then, of course, that brings up the point that you raised that, well, okay, that in that sense, the PAP is being quite gentlemanly, right? And not being as, as
Well,
outrageous
maybe let's say they are
as it
not as
could,
vicious. Yeah.
not as vicious as it could actually be, right?
Yes.
But then, as you say, there's nothing stopping a future government from being that vicious,
No.
right? And
Exactly.
that's kind
Yeah.
of scary, yeah?
Exactly.
So we have a number of questions already coming in from the Q&A, and please
Okay.
do continue. Starting with Bertha Henson, who also points out, and I feel very, I need to apologize because I thought I was very smart to name this webinar Fair or Foul. I thought it was very original, right? And Bertha
Uh,
points out that actually this was the title of her book on the GE 2020 elections.
oh gosh.
So
I think
there are no
we
original,
had
there are no
forgotten. Sorry,
original.
Bertha.
Sorry for plagiarizing you completely unintentionally. So
Well, I think
I
we
will
all
make
drew
it up to you
inspiration
by,
from the three witches in Macbeth, right?
that's true, yeah. I will make it up to you by giving you a free plug that everyone go and buy Bertha Henson's Fair or Foul, published by Epigram or Ethos. I'm not, sorry,
Yeah, well,
I missed that.
yes, actually, Bertha has also done something with an artist in this website called Chin Chai. It's called What the Fish. Actually, it's very, very cute. And they've got this, the fish are the constituencies, right? The bigger fish are the GRCs, the small fish are the SMCs, and she kind of explains, what happens when with this particular electoral redrawing of boundaries. So that one is worth checking out. I couldn't find it again. I saw it a few days ago, but I couldn't find it again.
So I hope, Bertha, all this publicity makes up with the fact that we recycled your title without acknowledgement. So the Bertha does have a couple of questions. Well, actually, quite a few questions. Let me just pick one because others may be long and technical.
Okay.
What sort of transparency can a citizen demand of elections that would be within the bounds of the Constitution? For example, a breakdown of votes according to subdivisions of wards instead of the entire GRC.
Unfortunately, our constitution doesn't give us the right to information. That is actually one of the human rights that's encapsulated in your Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we don't have an equivalent right such as this. That's why we are unable to push for something like a Freedom of Information Act and so on. So, what can a citizen demand? Nothing, I'm afraid.
So
Yeah.
the data that you were referring to earlier, how political parties have a sense of
Ah,
what the numbers are by precinct, that is because they have their own, what are they called, polling
no, no,
agents.
no, no. So, okay, this is I checked it with a couple of opposition people, and I said, look, at the end of the election, do you have any idea, how a particular precinct votes for you? And at least in the last GE, they said, yes, we got the information, but only for the constituencies in which we stood. In
Hmm.
other words, you will never know the whole picture, right? If you didn't contest. That's why I made the point in the talk just now that the one party that has access to all the information is the PAP because they contested every single seat. Yeah?
So the candidates and their agents know because they are there in the counting center. Is that right?
I think it's just given to them. I really don't know the process. I didn't ask that far
Right.
exactly. I mean, does it come in a yellow envelope or what? I have no idea.
Okay. We can, I guess, treat this as a comment rather than an observation rather than a question because there's no way
Okay.
to answer. Shi Tung Nyam asks, how come Bukit Panjang SMC, which was a closely fought election, has been left as an SMC? And this is the ward contested by Paul Tambaya. I suspect one answer is actually revealed in one of your tables, which is that Bukit Panjang SMC is the largest SMC. So the calculation could be that it's actually, even if it's a narrow victory by the PAP, it's actually very difficult to get
Yeah.
those extra numbers and win. I
Well,
don't
you
know.
know, they do leave some of these alone. Marymount didn't do very well either, but Marymount continues to exist as an SMC. So, you know, I mean, here we are all like second guessing, right? Because even though some commentators have said that the Electoral Delineation Committee has been more transparent these days, they tell you nothing. You have no idea why something is being done, right?
Hmm. Another observation from Shea Tung Nyam, which I think you will enjoy answering because it has to do with the court. Won't requiring a high court judge to chair a delineation committee run the risk of politicizing the judiciary?
Yes, except that even judges sitting in non-judicial capacities can have their decisions reviewed by the court. Of course, not reviewed by themselves, but reviewed by another judge. So there is no, well, yeah, I mean, outwardly it appears that there may be maybe a bit of a conflict. It may be politicization, but you know, I don't see it that way. I think. In any case, I'm not advocating having a judge sit on this committee. This is a recommendation from the old Stewart committee, right? I think it should all be independent people who have absolutely no political affiliation, you know, past, present, or even tangential.
Another member of our audience asks for comparisons with other countries. How do their independent boundary commissions operate? Adrian Leong wants to know that.
Okay,
What
I
is
have not done a
redrawing?
big study of this topic because, yeah, I mean, I haven't done a comparative study, but by and large, they are independent. Okay, there are two types. One is there is a totally independent body. That's one variety. Another is an all parties kind of commission, which means that all the political parties are involved in the delineation. So there's, I suppose, some horse trading all going on, which I suppose would still make it a little bit more equitable than to leave it to somebody who or committee that reports purely to the prime minister of the ruling party. And the other thing is that most of the at least I haven't looked at everyone, but most of them that I've looked at work on the deviation of about 15%, not 30.
Schutzli has more questions about potential independent commission. Number one, what is the difference between an EBRC and an elections commission? Can they be the same thing?
The
Secondly,
elections, yeah.
and
Sorry,
also,
elections commission is bigger.
okay.
They do more things. They do voter education. They are responsible for the electoral rolls. They are responsible for training the officers who will man the voting booths. They actually conduct the elections. They seal the boxes and so on. I mean, they have this job to do, which is much bigger job than just drawing the electoral boundaries.
Right. And you're not asking for that, I guess.
No.
That's not such a big problem as the boundaries. So my sense is that you have more confidence in the elections department and the work that they have done than in the boundary drawing process.
Well, I actually I do. I mean, interestingly, I was always a little bit skeptical, but a few years ago, I actually did a history project for the elections department, and I had the opportunity to actually sit around in the office and look at and all their various processes. And actually, yeah, I think they do a really good job of running an election. They really know how to do the job. And and they're very serious about this voter secrecy thing. So nobody, certainly the ruling party cannot in fact, nobody can ask to look at the votes once they are in the ballot box and sealed unless they get a high court order. So, this again is taken very seriously. And I've actually seen the vault in which, these electoral papers are stored before they're burnt and so on. So actually, I think they're actually doing a pretty good job.
Right, that's good to hear. Schutz also asks various questions, which I guess would be the kind of thing that we could get a better sense of by looking at all these different kinds of bodies around the world, like who should actually appoint this independent body, who should be in such a body, who should this body report to, and so on. So I suppose this shouldn't be too difficult to work out because, after all, we are kind of an exception, right? I mean, there would be scores of EBRCs out there in the world that we can learn from and pick up best practices from.
Absolutely.
This is not rocket science.
No, far from it, I think.
Right. Let me look for more of these questions.
Okay, there's a very interesting comment from an anonymous person who
Right.
says the data on voting precincts is not provided by ELD, but something individual polling agents and counting agents have to tally at each table based on the boxes. This is manually compiled by opposition parties for the wards in which they contest in. I see. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
I had no
So
idea.
this is the answer to the question that
Yeah,
we
that's right.
going about in circles on. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the intelligence out there. Okay, here's another one. Is it possible for the UN independent election observers to be invited to Singapore to observe our elections? Has this happened?
Well, usually the UN only gets involved in areas of conflict or where transformative justice is taking place. In other words, you're moving from, a kind of a war-torn situation or a toppling of a dictator, and then you're moving on and they're kind of having elections for the first time. That's when you have UN observers, really. Yeah.
Mhm.
Not
And it's
not
they
not not
would
for not for a place like Singapore,
right.
right?
So they would tend to be most needed when there's a high risk of election fraud, ballot stuffing, that kind of thing, right?
Yes, that's right.
It's
Or
really
or or or, or worse still, violence, right? Violence in electoral polling stations, threatening voters, that kind of thing. Yes.
Jason Yuan wants to know how much freedom in academia is there to criticize the ruling party. There were past cases in Singapore that professors got exiled for political views. How is the picture looking today?
Ah, actually, I don't know.
Never
uh,
heard of it.
hard question to answer. I think yeah, it's really quite hard to answer, uh, this question.
But thanks for asking it anyways. It's nice to know that people do care about the safety of academics. Right.
Right,
So
right.
okay,
Well,
there's a question from Natina Tan, our friend,
yes.
also writes about the way elections are organized and so on. And she says, my studies find that malapportionment has declined since 2006, but gerrymandering has worsened over time.
Yes.
First, help us educate us about the difference between the two. But also, she says one way to call out the EBRC is to have more data transparency at the precinct level. Is there any way to pressure or lobby the Election Commission to release the numbers pre and after elections?
Wow. Okay. First of all, just
Explain the
very quickly
difference.
to explain Natina Tan, by the way, for those of you tuning in, is one of the leading scholars on this area relating to Singapore polls, right? So thanks for joining us, Natina. Absolutely right. I think there is less of a malapportionment now because, okay, so when we talk about malapportionment, it's just about numbers. What's the difference between the biggest constituencies or the biggest ratio and the smallest ratio? One is to X number or so you got less of that. You're getting less of a discrepancy, more of an evening out, and that means less malapportionment. The gerrymandering story is geographical, right? And this is where it's really tricky. I mean, if you look at the maps, they are bizarre, you know. I mean, I don't know how to do this. I wish somebody knows how to get AI to do this, right? You put this map on top of the physical map of Singapore, you put it on top of the transport map of Singapore, you have very, very strange constituencies. And you have constituencies which are SMCs sitting in the middle of a GRC. I mean, this is totally bonkers. I mean, why would you have that? And why do you have, what is essentially, sort of a rectangular shape constituency, but with, one finger sticking out this way, another one sticking out the other way? Doesn't make any sort of logical sense. So if one were to redraw, right, especially now that people don't have these really fierce loyalties to a space because you keep changing the name of the space anyway, right? You might come up with a quite different map altogether. All you need to do is actually plot a demographic map of voters in Singapore, and then you overlay that with your criteria. In this case, you want 98 MPs. Okay, you split it accordingly and X number of GRCs and so on. And, voila, you have a map. And it will not look like this. Strange little fingers and digits poking out here and there. It's unexplainable.
Maybe the computer science departments at our university should organize a competition to see who can come up with the best AI model.
That would be fabulous. That would be fabulous, But to Natina's question, whether there's a way to pressure or lobby the election department, it's as good as saying, let's talk to the PM and see if he'll release the data. What are the odds? Sorry, lawyer's trick. Answer a question with another question.
Okay. Do you want to take a final look at the questions to see if there's anything
Yeah, sorry, it's a little
attracting?
bit small, and that's why I'm having to squint a little bit. Is McPherson a vote bank? I suppose they think it probably is. I mean, Tin Pei Ling has done fabulously well with McPherson. So if I were going to say, how can I maximize this? I will pull that in so that it will boost my overall averages. I mean, makes sense, right? Yeah.
Okay, let me ask a final question before we wrap up, which has to do
Sure.
with, what the twin terms that are often used to describe legitimate, proper election is free and fair. Yeah. Would I be right that what you've highlighted is that our elections are possibly, for the reasons you've given, not entirely fair, but this it's not really the same as saying our elections are not free. Again, I'm looking for a silver lining here, I suppose. And on a nice bright note.
Well, I think I mean I think the well, if one were to look for silver lining, the silver lining is this, that however clever these people who draw these lines are, they don't always get it right.
The voters can choose to misbehave and funny things happen.
no, it's simple, right? I mean, I'm always concerned about this because I'm much more interested in institution building than in the practice in what is really happening today. I mean, I'm of course interested in that, but I'm always concerned that the situation would change, and then what do you have left that will protect you from a system that may be not thoroughly abused from becoming one that it will be totally abused, right? Yeah. So the silver
Mm.
lining is, I think, yeah, you don't always get it right. And so, and you never tell, especially when new voters move in to particularly new places, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, we've also, I guess, highlighted the gray cloud within the silver lining, which is that things could get worse if we just assume that this very manipulable system is not going to be so completely abused, but it could be completely abused,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It could be
Yeah.
because, as I tried to point it out, is it from the legal point of view, you have no legal recourse. I mean, you could possibly try and say, look, this is irrational. Now, this is a ground for judicial review, by the way, right? But it will not be easy to launch such a suit. But
Hmm.
you could
Right.
you could say that the committee is acting irrationally in doing the following things, right?
According
Uh,
to it.
yeah.
I think one thing that may be encouraging some restraint is this principle that Lee Hsien Loong highlighted a couple of election cycles ago, which is that that it is important to keep the elections contestable, right? So I think even the PAP knows that the legitimacy of elections requires that they be contestable enough such that opposition parties don't just give up and say, look, this is a game we cannot ever win, and so we go to the streets again. And similarly, it is so eroded in legitimacy that citizens also decide that this is a mockery of elections and we're not going to take part. So I
Right.
think the PAP has been sensitive enough to that to keep elections as what political scientists would call the only game in town, open enough for people to be invested in, right? Um, and can it be more open? Can it be fairer in the ways that you've talked about? Natina again asks, I guess rhetorically, do Singapore voters even care about gerrymandering? Yeah, because we know it happens, or we have a strong suspicion that it happens. And yet most Singaporeans seem to be not all that animated about it.
Well,
Except
I
for the
think
200 people who showed up this evening, right? But
exactly. I mean, that's why I offered to do something like this. I feel that that's important in educating the public a little bit better, and that's why I am very grateful that other than academics like us talking about it, there are also others who are out there in using media, which we are, I'm not very good at doing. I couldn't possibly do a TikTok video, uh, but there are people who can do that and they can reach bigger and bigger audiences. And once people know, I think this would be something you want to ask your MP, right? How come you did this? Why did you all do that? And at some point, there ought to be a response.
Mhm.
Yeah. And on your point about, the only game in town, it has to be the game in town because, I think actually Lee Kuan Yew said something years ago, which was rather interesting, that in his student days when he first went to UK, he was at the LSE and he was listening to the lectures of the great Harold Lasky. And Harold Lasky was trying to explain how Britain had undergone this socialist revolution with the welfare state and the NHS and so on. And Lasky said something which Lee Kuan Yew remembered his whole life. He said, in any government, you must have a way to have a revolution by consent. There must be a means to have a revolution by consent, because if you do not have that, then you're going to have a revolution by violence. And he used that as an example of why certain institutions you would never tinker with, no matter how powerful you are. You don't touch them, because once you do that, well, you're looking for trouble, and then you got to have violence.
Okay, so not for the first or last time, we're going to let Lee Kuan Yew have the last word. Just kidding. Thank you so much, Kevin. This has been
My
extremely enlightening.
pleasure.
And I hope it has been as educational for the audience as it has been for me. Thank you on behalf of Academia SG. Thanks for the large audience who came. And please remember Kevin's words, we need citizens to care, right? And pay attention to these seemingly technical, but of course, extremely important details of how elections are run. Thank you and good evening.